All right, welcome to another WLRN live stream. I am Thistle Pedersen coming at you from the beautiful downtown WLRN studios. And today we are going to be speaking with Christy Hammer about Trump politics. She is a professor of sociology, education, and women and gender studies at the University of Southern Maine. So she is an American professor. We're going to be talking about American politics today. And let me read just a little bit more about our guest before I bring her into the studio. She has 40 years of experience as a professor, and she was canceled over a single claim of sex realism. 2 years and 3 investigations later, she was vindicated by the Maine Human Rights Commission that two sexes with variation, which is what she was accused of saying. Well, she did say it, that wasn't discriminatory. Sex realism is a valid point of view, it was found, and teachers need to discuss controversial issues in their classes. As a long-time DEI and Title IX specialist, so this is going to be great to be getting some insight into the cuts being made to DEI right now, too, by the Trump administration from a DEI and Title IX specialist. And she also is going to be talking with us about Title IX. So both of these are very critical. She's critical of both of these things now in our society, and particularly how the DEI veered into the policing of thought and behavior in schools, and now gender ideology has captured K through 16 schools to the detriment of all. Professor Hammer was punished for a few unintentional misgenderings of her student, but rejected taking yet another state zone training since she herself had co-taught such equity trainings in years past. So with no further ado, let me welcome Christy Hammer.
Hi, Thistle, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I probably am a bit unique that I had some cancel culture happen to me, but yet I was both a DEI and a Title IX specialist. I wanted to talk a little bit about Title IX, because, just briefly, the history, because I feel that many people don't realize that Title IX was an amendment to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So when the Civil Rights Act in 64 passed, discrimination was deemed illegal in the workplace on sex, race, and national origin, which is usually considered language. That's the Holy Trinity. But it wasn't sex, race, and national origin in Title IV of the 64 Civil Rights Act, because who would have thought of sex equity in schools? So it was just race and national origin from 64 to 72. So when Title IX was passed, someone recently said it amended, they thought it amended the Constitution. It amended the 1964 Civil Rights Act by including sex discrimination. What else? How many times in Title IX are women or females or girls mentioned? Right, 0. That's because it really was. I was a Title IX consultant at the New Hampshire Department of Schools for New Hampshire Department of Education for a decade. And Title IX was sex discrimination. That wasn't just against women and girls. Now, yes, most discrimination in schools and curriculum and instruction and athletics, etc., was hurting girls. But it was really very clear that it was the sex discrimination no matter what sex it hurt. For example, we use the Department of Labor statistics, and if a career had a 75% or more of one particular sex, well, it was considered then not usual for the other sex, and so it was okay under Title IV to do some programming for that. So, for example, I did tons of workshops on girls in STEM, getting more females in STEM courses and as well as careers. And I would tell superintendents, well, I would do something for males, but house nurses and secretaries and teachers, it wasn't the same kind of disparity in the labor market. I did, though, do a program to encourage more males into elementary school teaching, because that was encouraged under, again, Title IX is sex discrimination and barring sex discrimination. I want to mention one thing. Some of you might have heard of Pamela Smart. She was pretty infamous there for a while. There was a movie to something about dying that was popular, a made-for-TV movie. Pamela Smart was a technology ed tech teacher assistant at Winnacunnet High School in Hampton, New Hampshire. And when I first got the job in 1990 as the Title IX consultant for the state of New Hampshire and saw the files, who had been the Title IX coordinator or contact for each of the school district, well, you know who it was. Clear up until I think the time she was arrested for having an affair with her 16-year-old student, and then they shot her husband to death. She was the Title IX consultant. So interesting fun fact. I thought, well, maybe that's the final solution. Let's just kill all the guys. Yes, but Pam Smart in New Hampshire was the Title IX consultant. What is more important, perhaps, is that I thought I was going to get in trouble as the Title IX consultant, probably 93, 94, because I was involved in gay and lesbian rights issues. And I thought, does sex discrimination extend to gay and lesbian issues? So I used some of the Title IV money right from the feds to buy a curriculum package. It was anti-homophobia. It was called Sticks and Stones. And I sent this anti-homophobia curriculum to all the, I think, 75 superintendents in the state. And I sort of held my breath because I thought somebody would complain or say, what is this? How is this appropriate use of Title IX money? But I wasn't. Nobody said anything about it. So fast forward 30 years, I was sociology. I was an education professor. I was in, a class where I said the wrong thing to on gender identity. I said there were two sexes with variation. And I did not know that gender identity had ruined Title IX. I did not know that Title IX, I think Obama first started using the phrase gender identity in maybe 2012 in some regulations, and certainly Biden, very big time, doubled down on it. And in fact, some of you might have known the recent regulations after Biden doubled down on gender identity said, yes, if you need to decide between sex discrimination and gender identity discrimination, go with gender identity. It was so much of a men's rights movement, and that became quite clear how gender was being privileged over sex. And I realized, I feel even a little guilty that, did I start Title IX on this slippery slope by using some of the money for anti-homophobia, which I thought was a good thing. DEI, what happened to DEI? When I was trained by the Office of Civil Rights Lawyers in 1990 on how to work with schools to keep them in compliance with civil rights laws, again, that holy trinity, sex, race, national origin, I was told clearly, you don't, and you mentioned this, Thistle, you said feelings and behavior in school, but it's really the difference between we are to monitor, to try to correct discriminatory behaviors in schools. And those Office of Civil Rights Lawyers were really clear. We don't go after or monitor feelings or beliefs. It's behaviors. So you could have a very racist, and there are, right, racist teachers, but if they weren't acting in a way that at least was obvious, right, or assertable, it wasn't about beliefs, it was about behaviors. And I thought what happened to me was a clear sign that DEI went too far. DEI administrators, as well as professors in the humanities and the social sciences, don't think sex exists, that the sex binary is a colonial conquest brought by Europeans and imposed on, I guess, naturally androgynous indigenous people. I'm not sure. These are things, this was something that was said at a workshop at my university after I was removed from my class for saying two sexes with variation. And also that doctors just guess, they spread the legs of babies and guess at the sex at birth. So this is what was said in a Beyond the Binary workshop. Here's the thing. I've taught in women gender studies, a couple different institutions. I've taught beyond the binary my entire life, but somehow beyond the binary became among some of my colleagues, and I didn't get the memo. I didn't get the memo that 60% of Gen Zs don't believe in the binary. So I have now students that will say my high school biology teacher lied to me. I learned this by another women gender studies prof. I was told by a geneticist professor that biology profs don't want to talk about gender any more than humanities and social science profs. Some of them want to talk about the binary, and I thought that sort of said it all. So I thank you for letting me give just that briefer of Title IX as an amendment to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And, again, it wasn't until 72 that we realized, oops, we should have had that in school. And there's such a thing as discrimination by sex in schools.
Right on. Well, thank you so much for giving us that background, because it's incredible. I think there's a lot of confusion. It's like everybody wants to be promoting fairness and equality, but our terms have gotten so confused and our knowledge of and acceptance of reality, material-based reality has become a big issue these days. I used to believe that non-binary meant that you were trying to, not that it had anything to do with sex, that it had to do with socialization, that you didn't want to fit into these rigid boxes of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. And so I embraced that terminology, non-binary, and then I realized that they were talking about sex. And I feel like as a gender and women's studies professor, you must get that all the time. There's just so much confusion about what is sex and what is gender. I just wanted to, I'd like you to talk about that, but I wanted to welcome everybody to another WLRN live stream. We're speaking today with Professor Christy Hammer, who is a professor of education, sociology, and women and gender studies at the University of Southern Maine. I'm Thistle Pedersen, and I just wanted to welcome you. We don't have anybody moderating comments. I am going to be going over there myself time to time, and I will put messages up that you put. For example, Brass House says that Christy is an incredible source of information and that she just learned a lot. So thank you for that comment, Brass. And we are basically here because Trump won. He won the election, and it's got feminists in a discussion with ourselves about what it means. What does it mean? And so, Christy, first, can you just let's just touch on that, because that is why we're here today.
Good.
What does the new Trump administration mean for women and girls and for the women's movement?
Thank you. May I just briefly make a comment about sex and gender, since you brought it up, and just how those are so confusing and confused, and is sex how we're born, and gender is how we're socialized? That's what we said 40 years ago. And is that more complicated now? Of course. But one of the things we did in sex discrimination in Title IX in the 90s, we started calling it gender equity curriculum, teaching in a gender equity way. And we started using that wiggle word gender probably when we just meant sex role stereotypes. Gender equity training and curriculum and instructional strategies and etc. was sex role stereotypes. So anyway, just wanted to mention that. But yeah, let's talk about Trump. As a lifelong hard left, held my nose and vote for Democrats. I was the president of the New Hampshire Democratic Socialists of America for a while. So again, always you're quite hard left, picked olives for Palestinians a couple years. It's been hard for me to see the number of gay, lesbian, and Democrats that voted for Trump this time around, really just because of the gender piece and gender ideology. But I understand it. I completely understand it. I was a bit concerned. I think some of our gender critical sisters, buddies, felt because Trump had and has appointed gays and lesbians in certain positions that he wasn't going to be anti-gay and lesbian, but I am not sure if that's at all true. And I think the executive order, I think it got us sort of what we wanted in the sex realist world. We needed that, but of course it wasn't, I don't think, necessarily well written. It sort of messed up some piece of conception and sex development. But in general, it was exactly our kind of wording in the gender critical sex realist world. But at what cost? Because now I think already I am reading how the two sex and not with variation, not with a bit of a touch of intersex or maybe a bit of variation. How I said the idea that now two sexes, I'm afraid, is going to be used maybe by the religious right to turn back various advances that women have gotten in the workplace, in the military.
Can I just interrupt for a moment?
Please.
I saw a feminist sister expressing that concern that sex segregation could mean, oh yeah, not only will we have men's and women's prisons, men's and women's sports, but we'll have women in the home segregated into the home, and men will be out in the workplace, or like higher institutions of education. In the past, women were not allowed to go to Harvard, or these institutions of higher education. So
Right.
Will the right interpret sex segregation and have it be sex segregated everywhere in society?
Yeah, the health secretary in 1900 said if women's intellectual juices started flowing, their menstrual juices would stop. You can't educate women too much. And right, it wasn't until 72 that the Ivy League schools allowed women in, a very short amount of time ago. So that Trump turned back the civil rights law, the Department of Labor, and again, so I'm not sure. If I know a lot of gender critical and sex realist people seem thrilled that he did this decision, even if they don't care for him at all, as I don't really care for him. But again, at what cost? Because how it's going to be used, perhaps it might be even more regressive, like Marriage Equality Act. I'd heard, I think we're very afraid right now, like what's Trump's going to do, and what's going to happen today, that kind of a thing. So I think it is important to slow down and think about things that are happening thoroughly. I'm backed off from social media a bit, just on Facebook. It's just getting too upsetting. And so that's how I've sort of been handling it, but because I do think it's easy to overreact. But I did read now 2 times about people on the right going after the Marriage Equality Act. That really was just about 12 years ago. That's not that old, right?
Right.
And I want lesbians to be able to marry. I don't want them to be trans away the lesbians in terms of issues for young lesbians. And the research, right, with so-called gender affirming care, just from Tavistock, the number of young girls, and I have an autistic daughter. She could have been so easily one of those. Oh, I'll be happier as a male. They're autistic. They're eating disorders. They're bipolar, borderline personality disorder. I think just those 3 were over 70%. And those doctors at Tavistock said, we don't need to co-treat. We don't need to do therapy first. It's affirm and treat, or they'll kill themselves. And I'm thinking we're learning that's not the case. And
I mean, there's 2 executive orders, right, that feminists and gender critical people have been celebrating. One is defending women and biological reality, I think is what it was called. Defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. And then the other one is protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation. Well, I can definitely agree with well, the wording, I think, of both of them is really good. It's coming from our movement even, but I'm so afraid of how this is going to come down. And we've got a question actually from Tree, and this is a great question. What happens to the folks who have transitioned? There's no mention of protecting them. I mean, so many people have been mutilated, and have believed in this ideology. What kind of plan does the government have for having them, come back into society and be accepted, even though they've been victimized by this ideology? And Tree says they seem to maybe even be in physical danger. Certainly you have some male prisoners who are saying, I can't go back to the male prison. I'm going to be harmed if I go back to the male prison. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, not just the Nelson Mandela was touted for the Scotland self-ID law as freedom, which was ironic because what Nelson Mandela said was he was more proud of than ending apartheid in South Africa was after his experiences on Robben Island, he knew females needed separate prisons. So I've heard him quoted saying he was actually most proud of getting single-sex prisons. So it's just ironic that he was quoted in Scotland as, freedom for trans-identified men to be in women's, to be able to identify themselves as women and have access to female spaces and places. I want to mention DEI because also I want to mention that second executive order. I think this was that one I think was probably a bit of a overreach. I think there probably is a very, very small number of children that maybe do need some kind of gender care, but it's not this 4,000% increase of the last 10 years. And there's many now detransitioners, as we know. I've been hearing a lot of panels of detransitioners and insurance companies. I hope Trump requires insurance companies to pay for detransition. I know that has been an issue.
Exactly. And Sophia here Sophie is saying that nobody's looking to harm those who underwent medical alterations. I feel like that's some language that's missing, though. It's like all of these people who have been harmed, they need care,
Yes.
And I feel like the executive order language defending women from gender ideology, I love the language, but I feel like in today's world, it's like we need to maybe take some steps and be more gradual about it. And especially since the trans camp likes to be like, I'm a victim. We don't want to give them ammunition to make them into these faux victims, because they are, obviously the children are victims, but these men that are AGP men, they're not victims. They are victimizing. And so I just feel like somehow we need to dismantle the ideology and tend to those who have believed in the ideology and help them to detransition, like you're saying.
Yes, I would say that certainly in higher education, it's ideology over science. It's post-truth, postmodernist, lack of truth over any idea of truth. And it's really this erasure of sex, isn't it? And that's really what got me. It's like, what? How can I upset somebody to say that there's two sexes with variation? But you can in a world that is post-sex and thinks that sex doesn't exist. And I think every single issue that sex realists talk about comes from that erasure of sex. And I didn't realize that it happened in the civil rights laws, in Title IX, and in DEI in particular. Now, I just want to make a point that I don't want to get rid of DEI. This is where I think Trump went overboard, not to fire everybody that does DEI, but the idea that it needed to be fixed and reformed and not really being a gotcha in supporting students over this thing called gender ideology, which nobody really even knows what it is. And so that kind of confusing and the sort of going after people that, did a wrong pronoun and that kind of thing, that DEI got on the wrong path, but not really its own fault because of Title IX. Title IX, once it became added sexuality, which was wonderful. I do believe that's why I used 30 years ago some Title IV money to buy anti-homophobia. So it was good that they added sexuality, I believe. That covered then gays and lesbians. But the gender identity, as soon as I realized that had happened, that's highly problematic. I've done research now on what I call laundry lists, the civil rights protected categories, the sex, race, national origin, creed, et cetera, et cetera. Many institutions have taken out sex. They think sex goes under gender. At the Maine Attorney General, that sex is not on their laundry list anymore. Ann Minaj from Thistle certainly taught me about that, about how you get in trouble now on the moderate left to even talk about sex, and isn't sex just subsumed under gender? And I am shocked at how many, so that'll be interesting, of how many organizations that list out the civil rights laws that they stay in compliance with, and how they've taken out sex time and time again, or if they put it back in now, because now all of a sudden maybe we'll be talking about sex realism. And as sex realism is a way that's not, and that is not automatically equated with bigotry, with transphobia, the way I was. I mean, I just had a very few number of students. They called, because I'm a big, strong woman, they called me a closet trans. They kind of just guessed because I have big, broad shoulders. It was, and university professors, it was a trans student actually that told me, oh yeah, university administrators, they're afraid of us trans students. So I don't know. They really overreacted. It's also this term cry bully. I'd never heard of that. My whole class that thought, it was so brand new. This happened at the beginning of class. And so all these graduate, adult, mature students were like, oh my gosh, this person is crying. What did Hammer say to make this person cry? And so I had never heard of that term, the cry bully. And it's sad that that's a phenomenon.
Yeah, I'm unfamiliar with that term. Are you saying like they're crocodile tears and
yes,
that the
exactly.
bully is crying to manipulate? Yes. Yeah, definitely. That is definitely happening with these men, especially. So here we've got a comment from Tree. You can't be a butch lesbian anymore. And so I want to shift the discussion to the impact of Trump politics on lesbians in particular, because as you know, Christy, the left lumps the L with the LGBTQ plus. We cannot be our own separate category, which as a sociology professor, you understand intersectional feminism. Women are oppressed based on our sex. And it doesn't matter if you're Black or Chinese or any race, you're, as a woman, you're oppressed on that axis of sex. The male is above the female globally in global patriarchy. Now, if you're a lesbian, there's another axis of oppression. You're also oppressed based on your sexual orientation. And so the L really does not have enough in common, in my opinion, to be lumped in with the LGBT. And then also, especially the T. Like the T is in opposition to the L. Like the interests of the T are very different and in conflict with the interests of the L. So what do we do here? Because it feels like the L is a pawn in male politics, whether
Yes.
it's leftist or it's rightist politics, the L is just screwed.
Well, certainly there's been probably 100 years of literature and other thinking that how lesbianism is a threat, right, to men. I don't use that stupid word cis, but to men, that if you can have sexual pleasure with another woman, what does that do to all of our institutions of marriage and male supremacy and all that kind of stuff? But I do think that, well, here's one very sad thing. I was a big, some of my best, I'm 65. So I had my best friend, gay male, his partner died of AIDS. I knew a lot of people that died of AIDS, and I was out there, and I thought that in the 70s, gays, that's when gay men and lesbians, because lesbians joined that movement. I was really taken by lesbians marching with gay men on ACT UP marches in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, for AIDS activism, right? And I know some gay men that are hurt because they say, I fought hard to add that T, and now that it kind of took over and it messed up both gay men and lesbian women. And I think that there's probably a point to that. So there's sadness in the movement, and whether or not the acronym will even last, right? I mean, why would we have the I for intersex when that's 40 disorders of sexual development? There's often major health concerns with people that have intersex conditions.
What's the plus? LGBTQI plus.
Yeah.
Once you have a category
that broad,
that encompasses everyone, then you're not talking, anybody can identify in to be a marginalized group. And then those marginalized groups that are real marginalized groups just get lost in the soup.
And I certainly do know in the modern university, they are breaking down that acronym. They are talking and describing each one of those, what they mean. And this is why intersex is a sexual minority instead of usually pretty major health problems or can have health problems. And it's a disorder. I think higher ed is going to be a slow rock to move in terms of getting over gender ideology. And I think it really, again, is that difference between C.P. Snow, two cultures, the humanities and the sciences. The sciences are kind of horrified what's happening in the humanities and the social sciences. I mean, that's what I had many biology professors reach out from all around the world, that they're getting canceled if they just teach their subject, if they teach sex realism and the material, realisms of sex. I know one biology professor that added 20 PowerPoint slides, he said, on his week on biology of sex, and he said students' jaws would hit the floor when he would just go over how there's no spectrum between the XX and XY, between the egg and the sperm. There's no third gamete, right, as Helen Joyce says. And when he just emphasizes what we know, right, and we're always learning more, and maybe there will be a third sex, but right, so far, that's just not true. But you go to humanities and social science classes and they'll say, oh yeah, if you don't believe in multiple sexes, you're a transphobe or some other kind of bigot.
Right. So what somebody said here, what happened to critical thinking, and I would just add in higher education. I mean, come on. But getting back to the L and the LGBTQ, do you think that the Trump administration lumps the L in with the T? Do you think they see the L as something different than the T? Or do you think they're like the left and it's all just the LGBTQ? Like, I've literally heard people say, my child is LGBT, like they think of it as this one category. Do you think the right thinks of it as one category?
I do agree that I have students sometimes say it's just like a sexual diversity that they have, and they'll name the acronym, which is interesting. Here's what's happening to lesbians and girls that may be lesbians. This one of the people that reached out and was interested in our little group here that we have in Northern New England Women's Solidarity. It's called because a local school, a young female cut her hair short. You're not supposed to do that, right? Sexual stereotypes. It just makes you realize how much gender ideology is so regressive and so homophobic and is transphobic itself, I've now decided. Anyway, she did sports in middle school and she got her hair cut short because she didn't want to hassle with taking care of it so much with doing so many sports. She went down to the office of the school to get a schedule, I think her mom said. And the assistant principal that was also the coach was behind the counter and started calling her she, them. And it was really obvious that he was trying to make sure that he could say things where he used the they, them pronouns. And she thought, he knows who I am. He knows I'm a female. And she immediately thought, don't tell me, is it the hair? So anyway, the mother, she was curious too. So she called the assistant principal that she knew. And he said, oh, I'm so sorry. Yes. Well, we had a workshop by the trans rights organization, and we're supposed to look for signs of transing. And I thought, she had her really long hair and that was really short. And so I thought maybe she was transing. So this is what led one mother to ask what is going on. There's another mother here in Maine that leftists are criticizing left and right that she's a transphobe when she found a chest binder in the laundry that a middle school counselor had bought for this young girl. So not only were they hiding her a sexual identity or trans identity, but that they were purchasing, material for her to use. And I believe she tried to sue. And these are all leftist women. When we talk about the political difference, Thistle, what I've noticed learning how to be a sex realist the last 2 years is how many women on the left, moderate left, or even hard left are having, rapid onset gender dysphoria with their daughters, that are autistic, and the number of mothers on the PITT, Parents with Inconvenient Truths About Trans, I can almost cry sometimes, because some of those mothers said just what I said to a group of graduate students: two sexes with variation. Some parents, time and time again, actually on that website, I've seen when parents tell their transing child that, well, you can't really change your chromosome, you don't really change, your chromosomal sex. That's the last time they hear from their child. That is it. If my parent wants to, say sex is real, that shows they're not going to be able to support me. And that's, I think, is quite shocking.
Yeah, that it's been taken to this extreme
Yeah.
is quite shocking. Why do you think the left took it to this extreme? Why did the Dems double down on transgenderism and keep embracing it? But that brings me to the point of what Biden did right before he left office, which was the Title IX thing, right? Can you talk about that? Why
yes.
did the Dems double down on transgenderism, and were they loosening their grip towards the end of the election cycle?
Well, I'm wondering if what you mean by not necessarily Biden, but that Kentucky, the judge in Kentucky.
Oh, the Kentucky, right.
Decided. So really, all me talking about Title IX, I meant to say this might be moot, but I think there's a phrase from the constitutional history called eternal vigilance. And I think we have to have eternal vigilance over Title IX. I think some people are saying, oh, it's going to be okay now because a Kentucky judge, Kara Dansky, I think has spoken quite a bit on this, said that Title IX isn't about gender, it's about sex. Forget about gender in Title IX. And, you can't hold people responsible for pronoun use. So some people say, so that wasn't the Supreme Court. So that was a federal judge. So I really am a bit ignorant exactly what does that mean. It seems like people are just saying, okay, the gig's up and gender's not going to be included in Title IX anymore. And I'm just not sure if that's the case. But let's talk about what's happening in schools. One of the reasons that I got in trouble by this group of students wanting to be teachers is I said I did respond to something that was said in class the very first day, that maybe not all developmental specialists would agree that young children should name their pronouns, which is really then giving you the label of a sexual identity, right? To name your own pronouns as a young child. And I said, maybe that's not always, I'm not sure, because it was mandatory. I did not read that in some schools, pronoun use isn't just, sure, I'll use preferred pronouns if students give them to me, but they were mandatory in young kids. And so one of the teachers to be told a story to the class. She was very, I thought, proud of herself that her classroom teacher hadn't even done pronouns yet. And it was 2 or 3 weeks into the class. And so the teacher said she could go around and ask for pronouns. and an 11-year-old boy, she said, made a joke and said, my pronouns are she, her. And so the guy, people, and she said, this isn't funny. This isn't a laughing matter. This is very important to trans people. And, basically berated him, it sounded like. And then he said, okay, he hid. And, I just thought, what are we doing? I don't know if you know Virginia Urbibe. She started Project 10, which was 10% are gays and lesbians when we used to think that. It was the first gay straight alliance program in all of LA schools. And she came back to New Hampshire and did a workshop for us around sex and sexuality in schools. And she was already a grandmother, but she said people criticized her for the name of Project 10. This goes back to the 80s. She did this. And LA schools all signed on and they all had this gay straight alliance. Or I think that's what it was. And she said, well, Project 10, if you want to be about supporting gays and particularly lesbian, visibility and being out, why can't you have those names, gay and lesbian, in the name? It was called Project 10. And she said, well, I wasn't a 60-year-old grandmother till I could admit I was a lesbian. So I'm not really sure if we should. So that's all I could think of when I realized that we have teachers to be thinking they're doing the right thing by going around a classroom, upper elementary, middle school, and requiring them, okay, what's your pronouns? And what if that 11-year-old, what if he was a gay guy and maybe he didn't want to think ready to deal with his sexuality, much less than what his pronoun choice meant.
It's so inappropriate to be having children lie about their sex like that and to supposedly choose which sex they are. It's just, it does not belong in the schools. It doesn't belong in religion. It doesn't belong in government.
It had been a thinking activity, I think, when somebody said critical thinking. There was this idea in, I think, women and gender studies, what pronoun do you want to use today? What sex do you want to be today? There was this sort of visioning stuff. I didn't do it, but I know others that did it. And then that just went way too far. And the idea of, I think many people are shocked. And I'm not necessarily horribly against pronouns. I've used them before, but I did realize really quick about 5 years ago that it was sort of gotcha, the pronoun use. I've always had trans students. I support trans people, actually. But I used to have, Michael would sidle up to me and point to my roster and say, it says Michael, but it's Michelle now. And, they'd spent years in therapy and years in medicalization. It wasn't any of this rapid onset kind of thing. And I've always very much respected trans-identified students, and I always will. But there's something else that really has happened with this rapid onset and the pronoun insistence and the refusal to accept that the sex binary is real and it's not somehow this old fashioned. A friend, a colleague who was just with a bunch of graduates from Harvard, and she said that they were the binary somehow got, I think they were artists, and the binary got brought up, and these women that were Harvard graduates were all saying, yeah, the binary is so old fashioned, remember when we used to believe in the sex binary? And she, and we silence ourselves too, right, in the gender critical sex realist field, because if she had said something about that, well, sex is real. Do you know that on a trans youth support site, Thistle, I knew this is when we were in big trouble. This was probably a year and a half, 2 years ago when I was trying to research, and it tells young trans identified people that after a year of cross-sex hormones, their chromosomes start to shapeshift. That's my term. And that your X and your XY literally will start to, and so no wonder, right? We get way too much information on social media. Young kids don't read. The K-16, I think, teaching force is worried and nervous about how to treat gender different kids. I mean, I was always androgynous. I out bench pressed the guys, in high school. And so I was very sympathetic to people that were gender differences.
And you knew that doesn't change your sex.
Exactly.
And this is the problem, is that our preferences, how we wear our hair and how we express ourselves through clothing does not change our sex. But I want to get back to the Democrats and why they doubled down on transgenderism. And do you think, because it seemed like towards the end of the election cycle, the right came out with these ads talking about how Kamala supports the housing of male prisoners in female prisons because of this transgender thing. And she was silent. Now, was that silence like an admission that this has gone too far, that this is not popular amongst anyone anymore? You know, I saw Jessica Gonzalez online the other day saying, transgenderism is wildly unpopular with everyone.
And I responded back to the brilliant Jessica Gonzalez.
Yeah.
That's true, but not in higher ed. So that's very, yes.
So can you talk about like why didn't the Dems come out and say, you know, and Kara wrote that wonderful letter to Kamala, you know, why were they silent?
I think because I was surprised. I just know enough to be dangerous about sex realism and even gender critical. It's just been 2 years ago. I didn't know when I didn't know what TERF or Substack was. But anyway, I do think Dems were surprised. They didn't see it coming, that a lot of young, yes, mostly young men, but they didn't have the youth vote that they thought. And I think a lot of wasn't the research that gender was of swing voters was the number one issue, and gender issues of Dems, wasn't it the third, after inflation and immigration? I think that gender was the third issue raised. I don't know that we really realize that. And it's so easy to say it's a right-wing issue and they're transphobic and homophobic. And so many institutions have gotten more open-minded, like the Methodist Church here, this, just started to allowing gay and lesbian men and trans ministers. So I want to mention that I've always shared with students a survey, or I've long shared with students a Gallup poll, pretty good, pretty nice N sample size, that said that the researcher said that homophobia was aging out. And the reason he said that is because his research, for the first time, and again, this is about 8-10 years ago, for the first time, self-described conservatives under age 40, right? So young conservatives, finally, 51%, 52, just over half were okay with same-sex marriage. So even conservatives, young ones, like sort of like homophobia was aging out, and it was, hugely different under 40, than 70, 80. Older conservatives did not, weren't pro same-sex marriage. So to me, I shared that back then as a way that all of our society, maybe even the conservatives, maybe it was going to age out homophobia. Now I believe the research is, and we should all be horrified by this, whether we're gay, lesbian, bisexual, that I think the support overall now for gays and lesbians has now dropped because of the craziness with gender, I think, and biological men and women's sports. I think finally a lot more Dems woke up to that issue. But Seth Moulton in Massachusetts, he got death threats after he said, I do have some, my daughters out on the playing field. And I've had a lot of hard left people go after me big time once I wrap my mind around the issue of biological men and female sports, and how just study after study, tens of studies, have showed that biological difference just doesn't go away. And the number of females that have been hurt, and that we're putting on the backs of the female athletes to say, no, we're not going to do this. No, we're not going to play with that team. They are getting hurt so much. And I didn't really, the organized sports, there's so many qualification rounds and everything. When they check themselves out of a sporting event because they don't want to play against the biological male trans woman on the opposite team, that really hurts their chances and to continue and to get scholarships, etc. So what this has done to female sports And the idea, there was a Democrat politician who said, yeah, some of the guys might be kind of big for some of the women, trans women might be kind of big for some of the women, but imagine how happy we're going to be when the first trans woman is up there getting the Olympic medal. This is sometimes, I think it's intersectionality. You mentioned that idea that all the isms are connected. I learned that 30, 40 years ago, prejudice reduction wheel, and how the sexism and racism and homophobia and ageism, and, that they're all sort of connected around power and privilege. But I'm just not really sure. Someone said gender identity is intersectionality run amok. The idea that the rights of one group of people, transgendered people, can be more important than the rights of women and girls. And I'm afraid a lot of leftists don't really think that through, that's literally the decision they're making.
And I think part of that is because leftists think, oh, we had the 1970s and 80s feminist movement. Now women are equal to men, although we're not even mentioned in the United States Constitution, right?
Right. Yes.
And so obviously the 70s feminist movement did not create equality between the sexes in our society. So I don't know why the left would think that, but I've often thought, go ahead.
About a year ago, I posted, there was a very powerful letter to the UN on the rights of girls and girls and women need to be able to share views. And it was really about, sex realism, and they might not feel comfortable around, trans identifying men. So this UN letter that was just brilliant, I posted on Facebook, and I remember this expert in women and gender studies said, women aren't the group under attack right now. It's trans youth and trans adults. They're the ones under attack, not women and girls. And somehow how bizarre is that women in gender studies now have sort of moved away from women and girls?
That is an actual concern that I have about the executive order, it doesn't say the word trans in it at all. It just defends the rights of women, the sex-based rights of women. And so I feel like that executive order pits women against trans, unfortunately, because that's been the narrative. And
yes.
So somehow women and trans are just lumped together. And if women don't accept men as women, then we get screwed, and we get seen as, we're the ones that are the bad women that are not accepting these poor women,
20 years ago, I was contacted by a women's shelter here in the state as a gender equity specialist, because this women's I don't know if it was a rape crisis center or meeting or a domestic violence, but they contacted me because I knew gender issues, and they asked how they could, if they needed some help, because they had a trans identified man as a trans woman that wanted to attend these meetings, rape crisis or domestic violence. Well, in my sodded head, all I could think of was my gay best friend male and the small effeminate men that have been raped, gay men that have been raped in the military and other places. And I immediately thought of this guy who probably needs to be in a rape crisis center as a trans woman. I did not care, Thistle, one iota what those women thought. I was all about the women are the problem. How can we train women to accept this person? And the person that called me said, we're not sure what to do. We've had several women complain, including using the bathroom with this biological male that, certainly it presents as a female. They're not comfortable with it. Just think how different my worldview is now, that when I was listening to this story and advising her as a freaking expert, that I could not have cared any less.
Well, Christy, we're so glad that you came. We're so glad you came over to the feminist movement, and sorry that it had to be by getting attacked the way that you were attacked, but we're so glad you're with us here. I'm going to just put up this comment from Sophie, because I've been noticing a few comments in the chat about trans, and I think that a few women want to challenge you a little bit. that what is the definition of trans? Because many of us as feminists don't believe that there is a category of trans other than it's just this socially constructed thing. And it's so broad too. It's like, I can just tell you, I identify as trans and my pronouns are he, him, his.
Isn't it funny that half of us want to criticize the reality of sex, that sex is socially constructed, then the other half we will say trans is all socially constructed. I understand that is a split in our movement. I believe in gender critical, that there's the ultras that don't believe trans exists and don't want to use that word. In fact, every time I use the word trans, I have people now that will say, maybe they said it in the comments, you're validating, and reality, right?
Validating a lie.
And and so I'm not that I'm not exclusionary of trans to the extent that I don't think I know trans exists, because I've known trans people that have lived as the opposite sex quietly for 30, 40 years, and they just want access to their meds and be left alone. And I know saying that upsets people on our side. And so somehow we have to, on my Facebook, now that I have about 300-400 gender critical friends, it's such a tiring issue. I understand it's very, very important, but we do attack each other if we just use that word trans. And I get it. People might be right that say, don't use the word trans, you're just feeding into it. But I don't know if that's necessarily helpful.
This is what I mean about baby steps in our society. So much damage has been done by the promotion of trans ideology, by the idea that biological sex is not real and you can just choose it and you can change it if you want to. We've taken it to such an extreme. We need to back up from that slowly, I feel, and educate people. I belong in that camp, and that I do not believe that trans is real. I think, people, just like I don't believe that gender is real. It is real in the sense that it's socially constructed, but transness is even less real than gender. It's like, I've met people who identify as trans and they just use opposite sex pronouns. They don't change their body at all.
Yeah, and I know people will criticize quit talking about the older good trans versus the newer, bad trans, the narcissistic young trans, the rapid gender dysphoria trans. And, I do think there was a time when some trans people thought this was going to be okay. And it was really this narcissistic thread in the youth movement. For example, how crazy is it that the Maine Human Rights Commission said in their ruling that the facts of the matter is that this student that I offended was both non-binary and trans. Now, it makes me sound old-fashioned, but I thought non-binary was when you're androgynous. That was the old-fashioned word, right? Sort of, not ascribing to any strict sexual stereotypes. So this student was both non-binary, but trans. I had been, right, that you literally did transition. You're a biological male, and now you identify as a female, or vice versa. So how somebody can be both trans and non-binary shows how I think just messed up and confused, right? Both trans and gender.
Because they both don't exist as real categories based on real characteristics, that are physical characteristics. They don't exist.
Yep.
And so, I'm in the camp that thinks it's harmful to use the word trans as if it's a valid category. But it's okay. I think we need to figure out ways to unite ourselves in our feminist movement. I've been really disheartened and exhausted and very sad about women attacking women in our feminist movement, because some women went so far as to vote for Trump and to applaud, and they're so happy now about these executive orders, and they're feminists, right? They're saying that they're feminists. And then there are other women who are like, well, okay, I'm skeptical. This is probably a wolf in sheep's clothing here. How is this going to actually benefit women when this language is coming out that's so strong? Our language. It's like, are they co-opting our language? Are they taking it from us and twisting it somehow? There's those feminists too, who are really anti-Trump. Because, this is the guy who said, I'm going to grab him by the pussy. You know what I'm saying? Like, this
Absolutely.
is not a male who is an advocate for women and women's rights. Look at the whole what was her name? Stormy Daniels, going with a porn star and all of that. Like, this guy, Trump, is not a champion of women.
And how sad that we have a world where I know some lifelong Democrat, lifelong leftists that literally were crying, they said, as they read that executive order, because they've had their families broken up by schools, transitioning their kids behind their back. And again, I believe many people assume that kids getting trans in school are that's a conservative thing, right? That because if you were a left liberal, you would support your child, whatever they are. And they're mostly leftist parents, I've found. I will say, as a 40-year teacher, for better or for worse, and it's both, I try to respect all my students, right? That's what a good teacher is. You take them what they bring in, whatever they say they are, whatever their identities are. I wasn't going to tell the student, you're silly to call yourself a trans. I didn't know, I didn't care, and I wouldn't say that. So any kind of identity that people have and people go through, particularly in that young adolescent, young adult stage, teachers are to support all students, all different kinds of students. And so I think it's hard for teachers. They don't know how to respond to gender.
Students by teaching the truth and supporting them in the truth that there are two sexes. And, you don't need to personalize it, but just you're supporting your students by putting truth back into education. I wanted to say that Sophie's still putting your feet to the fire here, Christy.
Good.
Don't use the word trans, she says. There's no need to offend any women. It's like before you were talking about that story about how you were like, oh, there's a problem with the women in this shelter. That's the problem, is the women, But really, it's the man who's invading the women's space, and we need to advocate for the women's rights.
Yes.
So, I feel like in feminism, especially, we want to always be looking at women and putting their rights and their needs at the center of our politics. And yes. I think that's what these Trump feminists are supporting. They're like,
and the idea, whether you believe in trans rights or not, the point is that trans issues are undermining women's rights. I think we mostly can agree on that. And that's a problem that never should have happened. And we need to fix that. And did I mention I have students now that'll say, oh, my high school biology teacher lied to me about the myth of the binary. So no wonder they're gender confused now. They don't think sex is real. 60% don't believe in the binary. So I think this is part of the anti-science, post-truth elements in higher education and in K-12 schools.
Yes, absolutely. So we will see what these executive orders do and what the Trump administration does. If these executive orders are used for good, or if it creates an incredible backlash. I know here in Madison, we're a trans sanctuary. And the trans, movement is getting all up in arms, and they're so scared. They're so scared of the Trump administration because their rights are so threatened. And so you're seeing all this rhetoric in the Madison social media feeds about, if you're trans and you need help, contact this, And so I just feel like that's not good for the women's movement. That's
And
not
we're,
good for the
yeah,
women's movement.
and it's hard not to be overreactive. We were talking about how just with the horrible immigration issue, and it's so easy to think, oh, ICE is at my door. Ann Menashe and FIS, just to mention that wonderful organization again, that she's going to have a whole panel on immigration, women, issues of women and feminism in immigration. And I think that is so important. So I think there's a lot of pieces that can unite the women of the left.
I think that's very important too, and that leads us to analyzing what the bishop said. Yes. I'd like to get to that video, but when is that panel with Ann Menashe?
I don't believe it's still in development,
in the works.
But yeah, it's going to happen.
Okay, well, let us know, and we can promote that, because good. Let's talk about this bishop who made this statement and lumped trans in with immigrants, and how frustrating that was for me, especially as someone who, like yourself, I've always come from a leftist point of view, and I speak Spanish. I used to work for Centro Hispano of Dane County. Like for 3 years, I was working with Latino families and youth, and I'm very pro-immigrant, right? And yet it's like, now it's hard for me to come out and demonstrate that way, because it has to be trans immigrants. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not welcome. Same thing happened with the anti-war movement and the environmental movement. It's like everything trans just gets into these leftist movements and contaminates them. That no wonder they call it a social contagion.
Please let me just say this one piece. There's a legal aid agency right here in Portland, Maine, and they mostly help immigrants. And I was told the staff were begging for things like a language briefer on the recent immigrant refugee groups, and more cultural knowledge about the different groups that were coming in. And the one workshop that they got last year was from the trans rights, where they were supposed to do, how do you feel? If you really feel cis female, stand over there. If you're cis man, stand over there. And they did that. And I used to do that with Sandra Bim's sex role stereotypes about, the continuum of gender, not sex. And this lawyer actually was just, she thought, what's going on here? She is not necessarily anti-trans, but she said that our only professional development was on trans rights. And they said, well, they'll be trans. Some of these refugees from Africa country, they could be trans, which is true. But the point was, she said, we begged for, cultural information, for language briefers that we, so we can communicate better with these recent immigrants. But that's not the training that they got. So I get that's a great example of just how institutions are, as they say, captured
totally. And then they don't serve who
they need to,
that they're supposed to be serving, because of this made up fantasy of this other class of people.
But it's hard.
Really what it is it's a parasitic social phenomena that is siphoning off the goodness of our leftist social movements into a non-category, into men's rights, basically, into men's rights. And so that's so frustrating for those of us who do care about more than just women and girls. We care about the Palestinians, we care about the immigrants, we care about the environment, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to participate because you have to bow down to trans, And so let's get to this bishop's. We're going to analyze, friends. Do tell, who is this lawyer? Sophie is asking.
Oh, this was just someone that worked at the legal aid agency, and she became, she was horrified at what with the professional development this legal aid was getting, mostly working with African refugees, and what they got was trans rights training beyond the binary training. And it was just frustrating for employees that knew that might be an important issue to some people, but it's not what she thought they needed.
Yeah. All right, well, let's analyze this language, because when I saw it, I sympathized, and I could relate to what this bishop was saying, you know. But then afterwards, after listening to feminists discuss it, I felt really manipulated. And so let's just go and take a look at this language.
Welcome to Democracy Now!. Democracy Now! Democratic leader Chuck Schumer said Trump's
it's illegal
lines. The White House has announced plans to offer. We begin today's show looking at growing pushback to Donald Trump buddy. On Tuesday, she gave the sermon at the inaugural prayer service at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. She directly confronted President Trump, who was sitting nearby with Vice President J.D. Vance.
Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you. And as you told the nation yesterday, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God.
So I want to stop it right there. Right away, she's kind of accusing him of being like a divine king, like thinking of himself as, you know, chosen by God. And, you know, frankly, I get with that criticism. What do you think of that criticism?
Oh, it reminds me of students that'll talk about like their grandparents to say, you know, if God didn't want him in the White House, he wouldn't be, you know, that kind of, you know, religious determination kind of stuff. But yeah, that was okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I do respect. I don't know that she meant it necessarily as a criticism. Probably she did. And I do respect those who do mean it as a criticism. Like Sheila Jeffries is talking about his rhetoric and how she's done courses on the divine king in patriarchy, and that he really fits the description of that in a lot of ways. So, all right, let's keep watching and hear what else she has to say.
Welcome to Democracy.
Sorry about that. I don't know why it keeps, maybe I'm not going to be able
We begin today's show looking
Republican and independent, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust. Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you. And as you told the nation yesterday, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families.
All right. So right away when she does that, I feel everything else that she says is a manipulation.
She does certainly put gays and lesbians as you know, you like to think, and for all the right reasons, the issues of women and girls and women's liberation is different than even gay men, bisexual, so that she does lump them together very clearly. But what really jumped out at me is that she used that term transgender children. And that's what I think gave a lot of us that have had a bit of a wake up call to realize. And you know what here's the thing, and this didn't surprise me at all. Once I read or excuse me, I heard her in a later interview say that she had trans people in her life, that she had families with trans people that were very close to her. And this is a real phenomenon. I know people that studied Kinsey's sex report, you know, nothing except sex and sexuality and homosexuality when that was a word. But yet when they had a transgender grandchild, you know, they really had a struggle, you know, with it. Bernice Sandler, who's one of the most famous feminist women's, she led the Women's Research Center for Women's Research out of DC for decades. Bernice Sandler, she has a trans grand. right? And so all of a sudden, and I think it's very, very hard once you have a family member not to, again, affirm. And so I've known now quite a few gender specialists that just because they have a trans person in their family or close to them, they have to, that's who they're going to support.
Well, I mean, that's the classic argument. I know somebody who's trans. I have a member of my family who's trans. So how dare you challenge the reality of my situation?
Right. And she said it, in her follow-up, the bishop said, because I know, it was sort of proof and evidence.
It's the classic argument. And it's not a good argument when it comes to analyzing society and social phenomena.
What we know about the pain that that gender affirming care, quick and easy, no therapy, no nothing first, no other comorbidities treated first. What that has done to our society, the number of women that have had healthy breast tissue removed now, and then when they get pregnant and they have a baby, there's not all the breast tissue gets taken off. So I just had read about a woman, she was posting about it, how she had to get her breast drained because there was a bit of breast tissue that was producing milk after she had a baby, but there was nowhere for the milk to go out, right? So I think we have a lot to account for how quickly, one of my best buddies, he's a specialist in early childhood science education. When I told him what happened to me, he started crying because he had walked through as like the gender equity specialist with a relative, paying for a 15, 16-year-old to have her breasts removed. And he thought that, she could kill herself if the parents didn't, take a second mortgage out of the house or whatever and pay for this surgery. And then she ended up as a 20-year-old lesbian, that she never should have had the surgery, changed her name for a while, then changed it back. I think the German insurance data is the strongest, that shows 5 years after gender dysphoria diagnosis. And I'm sure many people here don't believe in that diagnosis. And I think Amy Souza does a wonderful job criticizing how bad that is as a diagnosis. But anyway, in Germany, insurance data, 5 years after, over 70% of females, over 50% of males, they did not have a gender dysphoria diagnosis anymore. So what's the rush? Isn't there a book out? What's the rush? Why do we think we have to? Why can't we let people wait till they're adults? And I do agree that adults can do whatever they want for their body as long as they stay in their lane. Trans identified people literally in sports and staying out of women spaces and places. So yes, so I think the idea that we can wait, children can wait till they're adults, and I do believe that should be happening.
Yeah, and now we've got this executive order that says that the mutilation surgeries and everything need to stop, and we'll see what that does, because there's going to be a huge backlash against that.
Oh yeah, and I had an email this morning from the sociologist at my university that talks about, teaches how gender doesn't exist anymore. And she was blaming, she goes, are you happy? Because I'm a sex realist. She says, are you happy that Trump is now going to hurt kids? Kids are going to be hurt because they can't get gender affirming medicine because Trump just ended it. I mean, so I got this, a hostile email just this morning. I'm not going to respond to it, from someone that's, thinking that was my fault or something, or I did that.
And, this is something that we were talking about before, which is the difference between policy and culture. And we need a cultural shift. And I feel like this policy is ahead of the culture change that needs to happen. And I'm concerned about that, because if that cultural piece hasn't changed and people haven't realized that trans is a lie, it's a manipulation, it's a men's rights movement. If people haven't realized that, then they're going to just rebel against these executive orders and dig their heels in more and be like, oh, trans are so oppressed. Look how oppressed they are, even though the word trans is not even in the one about women. It's like, what is the word woman transphobic. Just the word woman, Anyway, I know I wanted to get back to, we don't have much longer, because I don't like to go, some of our guests are leaving now because I don't like to go more than an hour and a half. I think I told you, but I just wanted to go back to the bishop and like how sad it is to me that I feel like she was right on about so much, and then adding that in there about trans children especially just made the whole thing. Let's watch the rest of it. Let's see here if I can make this work without jumping back.
Some who fear for their lives. And the people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meat packing plants, who wash the dishes after we eat in restaurants and work the night shifts in hospitals, they may not be citizens or have the proper documentation, but the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. They pay taxes and are good neighbors. They are faithful members of our churches and mosques, synagogues, wadara, and temples.
All right, so
See, I felt like if she had just made just marginalized people in general, low socioeconomic status, lower class, low social status people, it wouldn't have been then controversial, but it was, and if she just said, maybe if she just used the acronym.
Yeah, but she was talking about immigrants.
And that was, and wonderful.
Undocumented immigrants is who she was talking about specifically.
Yeah. So the idea that saying, gender minorities are also at risk by you. And, there's nothing wrong with the message of, we have a lot in our movement about how horrible it is. We're all being told, be kind, people that are sex realists, you're not being kind. And I'm sensitive to that. On the other hand, she, as a religious leader, just telling the incoming president to, be kind to they're all human beings, right? That's really her point. They're all human beings of different persuasions and stripes. But yeah, that was, in a way, I thought it was very powerful what she said about migrant workers and immigrants. And I heard he was angry at her speech.
Oh, he said that she shouldn't be a bishop. She doesn't know how to do her job. That was the worst. And she's clearly a Trump extremist hater. And, so did her statement do any good?
Yeah. I guess that I don't know.
It certainly didn't do any good in terms of from my perspective. I felt incredibly manipulated.
And the idea of issues of women and girls in immigration, and when it said that now ICE officials are going to be able to go into schools and churches and hospitals, it's a lot of women and girls and older women, in those schools and churches and hospitals. That's predominantly women and girls in schools and churches and hospitals. And now we're saying ICE can do raids in those institutions that had been a bit of safe harbors. So it's gonna be fascinating, and the idea that we already have plane loads of people being sent back out of the country is I think really horrifying to a lot of people. And I will let you know when FIST, Feminists in Struggle, has a panel on, I think, gender critical issues for women immigrants, and just in general issues of immigration for women.
And Suzette, also, you're mentioning FIST. Suzette wanted to give a shout out to WDI.
Good, very, very good. They're that's the second gender critical conference I went to. I went to FIST, I went to WDI in September. So amazing. Yeah, that was quite remarkable. Well, what they said in WDI is, we gather here to all affirm that we're not the crazy ones.
Yeah, and that community and that solidarity is so important to our movement. I hope that the Trump feminists and the anti-Trump feminists can find that common ground somehow, that we can have constructive conversations, and we can remain ever vigilant and critical of gender ideology, but also let's not aim it at ourselves, sisters.
The idea
you
that
know?
sex realism should be able to tie women across the political spectrum. I believe that conservative women, liberal women, when they see that what has happened with the erasure of sex and how that does undermine sex-based rights, and if we can really get, Biden didn't really do what he said he was with the ERA, but if we had the ERA passed, I think that could institutionalize or memorialize the idea of sex as a biological material reality. But we'd have to there's a lot of people that want to put gender into the ERA. So there are some that would
so
say
we have to worry about that. I mean, it's everywhere. It's like this gooey, sticky thing that's just everywhere in our society.
In 30 years, I was so clueless. I thought it was fine to talk about gender equity and Title IX, and look what it's become.
Yeah, look what it's become. Well, thank you so much, Christy.
Oh, thank you.
Are there any other comments that you'd like to make before we sign off for the evening?
No, I love you. I love your singing. I want to hear you sing again. And I'd like to sing with you. And I appreciate you for doing the Women's Liberation Radio. Love it.
Thank you.
I need some more stickers.
Oh, okay. I can hook you up with some stickers. All right. Well, I want to say goodbye to our audience. Thank you for tuning in and for participating in the comments. That always energizes us. And thank you to the future audience that's going to be watching this recording as well. So have a good night, everyone. I'm Thistle Pedersen, and my guest tonight was Christy Hammer.
Thank you for having me.